not a simple one, in half an hour or less to go through and discuss with you what constitutes a free and fair election. Now, we started first using this term several decades ago, but what's evolved over the course of time is rather than just saying an election is free or fair, free and fair, or free or fair, we've developed a set of international standards to actually bring an election against. So you can't say, for example, that an election is free and fair or it's not free and fair. The idea is how many international standards do you meet, how many international standards do you not meet. And the failure to meet one or two international standards doesn't necessarily mean the election wasn't free or fair. For example, I don't think any American election would meet free and fair standards if they had to meet all of the international standards. For example, we don't have what you would call necessarily an impartial election authority. Our election authority is an elected official with a party affiliation. So standards for free and fair elections evolved over time. They've been derived from declarations, from protocols, from treaties. They're generally international standards that have been articulated primarily by the United Nations, by the European Union, by the International Association of Parliamentarians, and such NGOs as the one I work for, IPIS, on occasion, and International IDEA, who have developed not only international standards, but sort of basic principles and points to actually go into an election and answer very specific questions, and I'll come back to that at the end of this, to help rank elections. Now, you don't have an experience here in Malaysia, at least recently, I don't think, with actual international elections experts, monitors coming in and applying these standards, although I think a lot of people who watch Malaysian elections have a pretty good idea of what's going on. All international standards can be traced back to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has been mentioned by me yesterday and by several of the other speakers yesterday. In particular, we're talking about Article 1, Section 3 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government. It shall be expressed in periodic and genuine elections that shall be universal and equal suffrage and shall be held by secret vote. Some other relevant articles from the Declaration include Article 19 about freedom of opinion and expression, and Article 20 that talks about freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Now, we derive from this a set of principles. What I'm going to do now is actually divide out what we mean by free and what we mean by fair, which are two different things. I've come up with sort of 9 points about free elections. Free election, for the most part, is one where fundamental human rights and freedoms are respected. And by those, we're talking about freedom of speech in the context of elections. This means freedom of speech and expression by voters themselves, by political parties and candidates, and by the media. Freedom of association. By freedom of association in this context, we mean the freedom to form a political party, or an NGO that works in the electoral realm. By freedom of assembly, we mean the ability to hold and participate in political events and rallies, and to campaign for an election. Freedom of information, to seek, receive, and impart information that assists voters. So you should be able to feel, whether you're the media, whether you're an NGO, whatever kind of voter information that you engage in, whether you're a candidate, that you should be able to impart your ideas freely. Freedom to register as a voter, freedom to register as a candidate for a political party, freedom to exercise your vote in secret, the freedom to register any complaints and to expect an effective and impartial remedy, freedom from violence. This comes from a different area of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And finally, freedom from discrimination. So these are the basic tenets of a free election. What I mean by a fair election is an election that's impartial, accessible, and in which basically there's a level playing field for all of the political parties and candidates to compete. The components of that include an independent and nonpartisan election management body. You've heard me talk about that yesterday. You're going to hear about it more today. Absolutely essential. Except in the United States. A schedule that ensures that the election is held at reasonable intervals. Remember that we want genuine and periodic elections. Clearly defined universal and equal suffrage. Equitable opportunities for the electorate to receive political and voter information. Unimpeded media access on a non-discriminatory basis. Equitable treatment of the voters, of the candidates, and of the parties by not only election officials, but by the government, by the police, by the military, and by the judiciary. Accessible polling places with private space for voting. Secure ballot boxes and an open and transparent vote counting process. Recount and contestation procedures that ensure that elections are conducted impartially. And finally, an election process that's not disrupted by violence, intimidation, or coercion. I'm going to take these, and I'm going to actually take these principles and apply them to each component of the election cycle. Violations on election day are the ones that you see most often in the press. We talk about ballot box stuffing, we talk about carousel voting or multiple voting or phantom voting. But actually, you can have problems with meeting international standards all the way through the process. I'm going to borrow here a diagram that was created by the Carter Center. Down the left-hand column, you see all of the free and fair aspects that I discussed. Things like equal suffrage, secret ballot, right to vote. And across the top are various components of the election cycle. So I divided the election cycle into pieces, and I'm going to talk about each piece of the election cycle and how these free and fair components apply to it. First and foremost, it all comes down to the election management body. You need an independent, impartial, and competent election management body that ensures that the election is carried out fairly and impartially, transparently, and professionally. The difference that this makes is absolutely crucial. Political scientists have been looking at this question for a long time. What I'm looking at here is the research of Sarah Birch, a political scientist who has been looking into the question of free and fair elections for a long time. And what she's found is a very clear relationship between the independence of the Election Commission and the degree of election malfeasance during the process, or election malpractice. And you can see a very clear relationship. The lower the independence of the Election Commission, the higher amount of election malpractice. If you do not have an independent Election Commission, you can expect a lot of malpractice. So you have something like Belarus up there in the far right corner, which has an election commission that is appointed by the president, answers directly to the president, and the only thing that it's efficient at doing is knowing how to cheat. And then you have, these are all more recent democracies, by the way. Then you have down in the left-hand corner places like Serbia and Montenegro, which had a lot of UN assistance and put together a really incredible election commission that really is independent and produces elections that are perceived as free and fair and that have the support of the citizens within the country. Okay, so we talked about constituency delimitation at great length yesterday. Here I've borrowed from the Interparliamentary Union, and I'm going to just describe what standards they apply to constituency delimitation. First and foremost, as I mentioned yesterday, the delimitation of constituencies must preserve equality. We're talking about one man, one vote. Second, if delimitation takes into account objective criteria like geography, pre-existing administrative divisions, and communities of interest, which it should not do so in such a way that it is violating the standard of equality and fair representation or non-discriminatory representation. And I talked about this yesterday. I talked about you create a tolerance limit, and you can take into account these factors, but within the tolerance limit. And only extraordinary circumstances would allow you to go outside the tolerance limit. So if you want to keep communities intact, you have to do it within the tolerance limit. You might set a broad tolerance limit, like 15 or 20%, but you can't violate it, not even for these criteria that I've listed here or that I've listed yesterday. The redrawing of constituencies must occur at regular intervals. We talked yesterday about delimitation triggers and why it's important to do this. If you sit passively and don't delimit districts, what you'll end up is with malapportionment, which violates the first and foremost principle of delimitation, and that is equality. And finally, delimitation must be transparent, and it must allow for public information and participation. Voter registration. I've identified 3 principles here to guide the voter registration process. The first one is that every citizen has the right to access to an effective, impartial, and non-discriminatory procedure for registration. Any disqualification has to be on objective, verifiable grounds listed in the law within international standards. So, for example, you can say you have to be a citizen to register to vote. You have to live in an area for a specific period of time. But you can't say things that aren't objective or verifiable, or, for example, what some countries like the US had for a long time was a literacy requirement. You had to come in and do a written test. And our government and international standards have now held that, of course, you can't really do that. It discriminates against people who are not educated. Anyone denied the right to be registered must be entitled to appeal the decision and expect that if an error has occurred, that it will be corrected promptly. So you need an impartial body to decide whether you've been denied registration on credible grounds, objective grounds, grounds that are within not only legal standards in the country, but international standards. So this puts some constraints on the election management body. The election management body, in order to comply with international standards, has to provide the necessary information. You have to know where to register to vote, what you need to register to vote, what the qualifications to register to vote are. They have to make it accessible to you. If you live in a remote area, they can't put you in something too great to go and find a place to register to vote, or have hours that are too narrow. And you have to expect it to occur in an efficient and effective and accurate manner. In terms of voter education, voter education is necessary to ensure the effective exercise of the franchise. Citizens should be aware of the contests that they're being asked to decide, the candidates that are competing with, the parties that they're affiliated with, if they're affiliated with the party, when and where and how they have to vote. These things are important because you want citizens to be able to cast a legally valid vote, and you want them to be able to participate meaningfully in the voting process. Again, this puts some duties or tasks on the part of the election management body. The election management body has to undertake a voter education program, and this has to reach as many eligible voters as possible. These voters speak another language, then the information has to be available in that language. These voters live in an inaccessible part of the country, an effort has to be made to reach these voters. It's on the shoulders of the election management body to provide the necessary education to allow these voters to vote effectively. Also part of this is, at least with regard to government-sponsored, government-controlled media, the political parties and candidates must have access to media. And in fact, they must have enough access so that we can know that voters are adequately informed. And it goes beyond that when you're talking about government-sponsored. You must actually provide equitable access to all of the political parties and candidates. There are different formulas in different countries as to what this equitable access to media can look like, and it often applies only to government-sponsored or government-controlled media. Otherwise, the rule is you have to offer access in a non-discriminatory way, but of course there's recognition. If you're talking about a private media source, that if you have to pay for it, the political party does have to come up with money. But this isn't the case in terms of international standards with regard to government-sponsored media. In terms of political parties and candidates, groups and individuals have the right to form political parties and to have the necessary legal guarantees to actually allow them to compete with other political parties with equal treatment before the law that cannot be discriminated against. And every adult citizen has the right to seek political office individually or as representatives of political parties. And finally, political parties and candidates can be subject only to reasonable and equally applied registration procedures. So things like nomination dates can't be too short. Monetary deposits have to be reasonable and not discriminatory. You can't charge outrageous amount of money for a political party to register. In terms of the election campaign, it must be conducted in a free and fair atmosphere with no administrative action on the part of the government or the election management body to repress any political party or candidates, and no violence or intimidation can bar these parties and candidates from freely presenting their views. There's no government-sanctioned violence or coercion. There can be no discrimination against candidates in terms of the application of laws, regulations, or administrative procedures. In terms of the media, no candidate or political party should be denied access to the media in order for voters to become aware of the views of these political parties. As I mentioned, coverage by state-sponsored media should be neutral, unbiased, in a non-discriminatory and fair manner. Voting operations, the secrecy of the vote must be preserved in all aspects of the polling operation. Voting procedures should ensure that the voters are registered promptly, they are adequately identified, and there are mechanisms in place to prevent fraudulent voting. Procedures must be implemented to safeguard the integrity of ballots, both before, during, and after the election, to prevent vote fraud. Polling places must be established in locations that ensure that voters have an equal opportunity to vote in a way that's not unduly burdensome. You want to have as many polling places as possible located in central areas. And voters must not be subjected to any form of harassment or intimidation on the part of the government or any government-sanctioned coercion. Vote counting, the counting of the ballots, as well as the transfer of the ballots and receipt of the ballots at the other end of the process must be transparent. It must be open to observation by all the representatives of the political parties, as well as other observers, preferably some international observers. The announcement of the results should be carried out quickly and in a transparent manner, and all sensitive election materials should be held at least through all of the any sort of complaints procedures that follow. And finally, in terms of complaints and dispute resolution, voters and candidates and political parties should have the ability to register complaints, should have their complaints heard by a competent and impartial body, and be able to appeal these decisions to a relevant and impartial court. And all of these complaints should be subject to expedited process of consideration. And finally, all aspects of the consideration of the complaints by the election bodies must be transparent, must be impartial. Now, why is all of this important? Well, we know that it's important to have international standards. The credibility of the election is going to rest on whether you meet these international standards or not. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about some political science research. There's a large survey called the World Values Survey, and it's conducted every year, and for the first time in the sixth wave, some political scientists involved in something called the Election Integrity Program inserted some questions that are relevant to various aspects of the election cycle. So these are the 9 questions that were asked during this World Survey. It's going to cover 20 countries between 2010 and 2014. At this point, it's covered, when the research was published, it covered 8 countries. We've got 8 countries with responses between 2010 and 2012. And the public, randomly selected, were asked to answer these questions. And what we found was a pretty varying degree of what the public thought about the elections in the country. So you have some people, a lot of variation. People in Uruguay, for example, feeling that votes are counted fairly, election officials are fair, voters are offered a genuine choice in elections, and journalists provide fair coverage. So Uruguay does very well on this, and I've sort of ranked these countries by how well they did. Then you have Ukraine down there with barely a fourth of the people agreeing with these statements, with the exception of the journalists at the end. So a lot of variation across these 8 countries. You've got Zimbabwe here about halfway all the way through, and this is covering the last election in Zimbabwe. So 4 of the questions addressed good practices. Did it meet sort of international standards in terms of good practices? And then 5 of the questions looked at malpractice in elections. Are opposition candidates prevented from running? In the TV news favor the Republican Party? Are voters bribed? Rich people can buy elections. Are voters threatened with violence at the polls? And you can see again a lot of variation with Uruguay, with the exception of the first question, scoring very well. But then you have countries like Nigeria where 66% of the people felt that they faced violence from going to the polls. This information was used to subjected to some statistical analysis, and this is what we found. This is pretty self-evident, but now political scientists have proven, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that election integrity strengthens institutional confidence. Confidence in political parties, confidence in the parliament, confidence in the government as a whole. The black line is confidence in the government as a whole, and you can see very direct, very strong relationship between believing that the election met international standards and having confidence in the government. You can also see a very strong relationship between confidence in the election and the turnout, the interest in participating in the political process. The fairer you feel the process is, the more likely you are to actually make the effort to turn out and vote. If you think that the election is decided before you even walk into the polling booth, why even bother? Clear relationship between what you think is happening with the election and your incentive to participate. Conversely, election malpractices damage confidence. The more you feel that your government and your election management body has exercised malfeasance during the election, the less confidence you have in your government. And finally, the more you feel that there is election malpractice, the more likely you are to trigger protest. And we're not talking about just sitting back and not going to the polls, but protest on the streets. So it's actually in the government's best interest to avoid the point at which the public perceives the election process as so damaged beyond repair that protests like the Arab Spring begin. A very clear relationship between meeting international standards and the propensity to actually, in the end, protest. I mentioned earlier that what's evolved over time is, I just listed some sort of broad international standards. But what international observers have now done is develop really a checklist. So when an international observation group comes into the country, they have a handbook, for example, and they're going to go through, and they're doing some very specific factors. I just gave you very broad international principles, but election observers will come in, and this page has to, there's actually about 8 pages that have to do just with voter registration. And the observation group will come in and evaluate the country on each and every, of course this can be done domestically as well by domestic observers who have been trained and have handbooks in hand, but I'm using the example of OSCE observers who use this set of criteria, a booklet, they go in and they check mark the country. Like I said, you can do poorly on a couple of things. You can even do poorly maybe on 25%. And still, it's decided that it's free and fair. But part of what's behind this is purposefulness. In other words, let's say you fail about 25%, but what it looks like is untrained election management body. So in areas where you have elections where you haven't been holding elections for 30 years, where you're, for example, Sierra Leone, and you're just out of a post-conflict situation. There's a lot of, the international observers give you a lot of room for errors. And if not, if they're not purposeful errors, and they aren't sort of leaning towards the ruling party in every instance, then there's more room for errors. If you've been running elections for a long time, and you still have a lot of errors, and it looks like it's purposeful, then you will get a rating of not meeting international standards and the election not being free and fair. So it's not just a tick mark, it's a tick mark plus looking at the context of the tick marks. Democratic elections were first recognized as an international human right in the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And they're necessary, free and fair elections are necessary for the stakeholders in the public to perceive the election process as credible and the outcome and the government as legitimate. And going back to what I said about protest, the Attorney General of the United States has emphasized the role of elections in bringing about not only confidence in your government, but sustainable peace. The true measure of an election is whether it engenders broad public confidence in the process and trust in the outcome. An election run honestly and transparently, respecting basic rights, with effective and neutral support of state institutions and responsible conduct of participants, leaders, candidates, and voters, is most likely to achieve an accepted and peaceful outcome.